Welcome to our spring 2021 webinar series, Finding True North in the Midst of Change, Veteran Transition and Moral Injury. I'm Eileen Schell. I'm a professor of writing and rhetoric at Syracuse University, and I'm coordinator and co-founder of the Moral Injury Project. It will be my honor shortly to introduce our guest presenter today, Reverend Dr. Zachary Moon. But first, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous peoples on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands. And I'm going to also open up with introducing Dean Conkle of Hendricks Chapel. He will be speaking for a few minutes, and then we'll be introducing Dr. Moon.
Thank you, Dr. Schell. Greetings, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for being with us for this special presentation. The Moral Injury Project is mission critical to the work that we do at Hendricks Chapel, where we are consistently and hopefully compassionately and courageously seeking to nourish the spirit and soul of our campus community and far beyond. And as we think about our priorities here at Syracuse University, we know that veterans, student veterans, and their family are absolutely critical to all that we do. So I'm delighted that Hendricks Chapel can help to provide this program to you so that we can not just be informed, but together we can be formed and we can be transformed to be better and to do better. Yes, on behalf of our student veterans, but veterans, military families, and far beyond are on this topic of moral injury. So I want to thank Eileen, thank all of our organizers, and thank you especially Dr. Moon for being with us at Syracuse University virtually this day. I wish everyone a wonderful afternoon. Thank you, and Eileen, back to you.
Thank you. So this event would not have been possible without the support of Hendricks Chapel, Dr. Brian Conkle, the Dean of Hendricks Chapel that you just heard from, staff members at the chapel who've supported this event, Delaney Van Way, Peg Northrup, Alex Snow, and also intern Christina Cole. And many thanks to our captioner and ASL interpreter who are making this an accessible event for the community. And a big thanks to the generous donors who made this event possible. I also want to thank the Moral Injury Project Steering Committee, Susan French of the Montessori School, and our two steering committee members who will serve as moderators today. Jennifer Reddy, who's Veteran Service Coordinator and Associate Director of Continuing Education at Lemoyne College, and Jen Jeffrey, an academic librarian at SUNY Plattsburgh and a U.S. Coast Guard veteran. So today's program, Diagnosing Moral Injury, Definitions, Deficits, and Development of Understanding, will feature Reverend Dr. Zachary Moon, Associate Professor of Theology and Psychology at the Chicago Theological Seminary. Dr. Moon is a nationally recognized voice on the topic of moral injury, lecturing and leading workshops and trainings across the U.S. He's the author of Coming Home, Ministry That Matters with Veterans and Military Families, which came out from Chalice Press in 2015, and also Warriors Between Worlds, Moral Injury and Identities in Crisis, published by Lexington Books in 2019. Dr. Moon has been on the front lines of ministering to service members, veterans, their families, and communities. He has served as a chaplain in multiple contexts, including the United States Navy Reserve from 2011 to 2019, and also at the Pathway Home, a residential treatment program for combat veterans diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. He has also been a chaplain resident in the VA hospital system. After Dr. Moon's remarks, there will be time for questions and responses from the audience via the chat function. So feel free to type in the chat during the session, but also questions, comments for afterwards. And our two moderators, Jen Reddy and Jennifer Jeffrey, will be bringing those comments and questions forward to be addressed. Without further ado, it's my honor to welcome Reverend Dr. Moon.
Thank you so much, Eileen and Brian, and all of the folks who have been involved in helping to make this possible. I've shared screen with you just to have an opportunity to have some visual displays during my remarks. I am glad to be able to have the opportunity not only to be with you today, but also to return and be with you again at this time next week to further build upon this material. And I think for the sake of getting started in this conversation, I wanted to take some time to be deliberate in our thinking about the kinds of concepts and ideas and assumptions that we have about moral injury, to slow down long enough to realize where some of those ideas come from and the impact that those ideas have, uh, even as we understand our own experience and also the experience of others that we may have an opportunity to respond to as chaplains, as teachers and educators, as family members, as friends, as a part of this work. Um, and to me, I'll just sort of surface to you a couple of working assumptions that I have about our time together. One is that you all are taking this time out of your day because you care about moral injury for any number of reasons. Recognizing that some of you may have been working with some of this material, either in your own experience or in those who are important to you for years. And some of you may be newer to this material. So I'm going to do some kind of foundation building work that may already be familiar to you, but I hope you can bear with me so that we can kind of get ourselves all up to speed with some common language. The other working assumption that I'm making is that moral injury is perhaps a broader and more inclusive idea than we may currently be utilizing it. So as many of you are probably aware, most of the research and the work that has been done around moral injury has really located itself within the context of military service. Moral injury gets started as an idea through the VA hospital system and the interaction the clinical psychologists are having with Vietnam War generation veterans in particular. And in as much as it sort of gets started there, it is something that is very much within the particular kind of constraints of a clinical and medical paradigm as we get started, and very much is influenced by our pre-existing ideas about post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, kind of prior to that. And in fact, much of what we see as kind of visible expressions of moral injury looks like the kind of visible expressions of post-traumatic stress disorder. We would recognize those and a kind of symptomology, the kind of symptoms of this kind of traumatic, this traumatic suffering as being one or more of the following symptom clusters. One cluster is attached to hypervigilance. That's the kind of clinical term for someone who is kind of, the military language would be always having your head on a swivel, right? Scanning kind of each and every space that you're in, thinking about maybe who is behind you or sitting in a place where no one can be behind you so that you can sort of fully scan the environment. Hyperarousal is a clinical term that speaks to the kind of biochemicals that may be present in your body, like adrenaline and others that really keep you on edge. And being on edge and also having your head on a swivel really go together to make sure that you can be as aware as possible at potential threats or danger in your environment. Um, Along with that comes certain behaviors or responses that generally have to do with avoidance, right? Avoiding certain places or activities or even people who we perceive as being potential dangers, either to our well-being or even just the danger that we might get triggered by those places or spaces, activities, or people as such. Then you also have got a cluster of symptoms that are known again clinically as um, intrusive thoughts or memories, sometimes called flashbacks, or trouble sleeping, nightmares or night terrors. that some or all of those symptoms may be going on for folks who have post-traumatic stress disorder. Those same symptoms, at least at the surface of kind of what's visible in terms of being expressed, are the same symptoms largely that happen with moral injury. So um, when we're looking for moral injury, it might look like that, right? And that may be helpful, but as many of you already know, moral injury comes from a different kind of traumatic experience than what you find in the diagnostic manual around PTSD. So while it might look the same in terms of the expression of traumatic symptoms, it in fact is coming from a place, coming from an experience. Those symptoms are being generated by a different traumatic story. And so while they might look the same and might get treated even some of the same ways within a clinical paradigm perspective, some different stuff is happening there. So for our time today, I want us to use this as our kind of working definition of trauma so that we can see the way that the kind of larger landscape of trauma understanding is really how very much formative in terms of how we think about moral injury. The way that I think of trauma in terms of how it functions is that trauma is that which overwhelms normal functioning, normal coping strategies, and normal meaning making. And where that trauma comes from, as I said, can come from some different trauma stories, but that's what trauma is about. If it doesn't overwhelm us, it's not trauma. And if it doesn't impact our normal functioning, coping strategies, and meaning making, then, again, we're just kind of having a bad day, but otherwise our kind of way of going about our lives is more or less unaffected. So trauma is overwhelming in its effect of these parts of ourselves. Now, I want to slow down enough I hope you heard me say normal. Okay. Now, normal is a very, very fraught term, right? Because normal to me isn't necessarily the normal to you. So if we are providing care or hearing somebody's story and we hear certain maybe, kind of deviations or changes that are happening for them, we need to understand where their baseline is, what's normal for them. Likewise, what's normal for me, and that those two may not in fact be, equivalent to each other. In certain traumatic situations, one or all of these might be getting impacted. So the way in which we're dealing with a trauma, again, it might be different for me than different for you, but this gives us, I hope, a kind of open and inclusive enough definition of trauma that we can have a kind of a sense of how to proceed from there. One of the challenges that we have with our understanding of trauma and then gets transposed onto moral injury is what I call the Bad Tuesday hypothesis. And that is that our focus is really on acute traumatic events, whether moral injury or PTSD or otherwise. And the idea is essentially this: on Monday, I'm all good, right? I'm in the green, I'm all squared away on Monday. And then a bad Tuesday happens, right? A bad event happens. And then on Wednesday, I'm all messed up. Now, there are certainly traumas that look like this, right? But I'm also a little suspicious about this conception of trauma because, in fact, not all traumatic experiences conform to this equation. And you can see from my very rudimentary illustrations, and you'll have to get accustomed to my very amateurish ability to visualize some of these ideas. And please be merciful in your attention to them, because I want to illustrate some points, but I am not an artist, and you will appreciate that immediately. One suspicion that I have about this idea of trauma is that most of us, at least everyone that I have met, is not altogether squared away and green on Monday, right? All of us are kind of dealing with some stuff on Monday. And we were dealing with some stuff last week. And some of us were dealing with a lot of stuff. I think about folks that I served with in uniform. Most of the Marines that I served with in my 5 years in uniform, which is a relatively brief time, but certainly enough time to appreciate what was happening here. Many of those Marines were trauma survivors before they ever entered the military. And it felt important for us to include that in our understanding of what was going on in this moment, right? So even if it was a bad Tuesday trauma, it felt like we needed to understand what came before the bad Tuesday, certainly with more nuancing and complexity than sometimes we were. And you'll see certain kinds of therapeutic approaches that really want to focus on the bad Tuesday event, and may not sort of be getting as much of the other material kind of included. So I want us to be able to think broadly and inclusively enough that we recognize that there might be more going on here than just what transpired on Tuesday. The other thing is I was working with folks, particularly as a chaplain, is that I realized even after a bad Tuesday, and certainly in the aftermath of any kind of trauma, it wasn't like folks were altogether falling apart on Wednesday. There were still ways in which, at least if I was having the opportunity to be in space and conversation with somebody, that they were still very much surviving in the aftermath of that experience. And I also wanted to think about how my response and relationship that I was building with them, to not just perceive them as being all the way broken or just sort of radically fallen apart, but I wanted to be able to see the strengths, the resilience of their own survival capabilities in the aftermath of trauma. So this particular equation kind of has some issues with it that I wanted to understand perhaps more fully. And so what I have been thinking about is, how can we have something more like a multifocal lens, right? Something that doesn't just focus on the acute dimensions of trauma, right? The kind of bad Tuesday, kind of singular, particular, this was a bad traumatic event that happened in this person's life. But how could we take a multifocal lens that would begin to really think about the kind of complex dimensionality of, in fact, many traumas that are happening in our lives and in our society and in our world? I wanted to be able to think about the chronic dimensions of trauma, right? That not all trauma was just bad on Tuesday. Some traumas were happening last week and last month. One of the traumas that really highlights the complexity of this situation would be thinking about intimate partner violence, or sometimes called domestic violence. If you were being subjected to intimate partner violence, you would be dealing with acute trauma, right? In the case of being targeted by that kind of violence. But in as much as that's happening within that intimate partnership, within that domestic setting, there are also chronic dimensions. Okay, you are living with this this person who's targeting you, this perpetrator of this violence, not just on bad Tuesday, but also on Monday, also last week, also last month, and maybe going back. Those dimensions have to be contended with. Also, when we think about a trauma like that, there are environmental dimensions of this trauma. Those could include things like economics, like poverty, right? My ability to survive in a domestically violent context is further shaped and informed by environmental factors. It might not just be as easy as getting out of that household, getting out of that domestic setting, because in fact, I may not have the economic or fiscal wherewithal to do that, right? We want to be able to think about those environmental factors like poverty and economics and political dimensions as well that might be happening there. There are also intergenerational dimensions of this. And again, domestic violence is a clear example of this, that oftentimes both perpetrator and target of IPV or DV may in fact be related to family systems who have known that particular kind of trauma previously, right? So that what we carry with us is not just what happened on bad Tuesday, not just what happened last week, but in fact, in a very real sense, we carry forward with us the stuff of our family, what in family systems might be called your genogram, right? Your sort of complicated family tree. We are vessels of that. We carry that in a significant way. And what we begin to also understand through epigenetics and sort of similar studies that are integrating epigenetics is that in fact our very DNA is carrying traumatic experiences that are transgenerational, right? That are the stuff of our ancestors that we may not even sort of be consciously aware of in a way that we might be of our family of origin, but that in fact that is a part of the very substance of who we are. If we begin to use a multifocal lens in understanding trauma, we will begin to identify that there is trauma, not only that doesn't conform to that kind of acute trauma, the car accident or the day the Humvee got blown up over there, but that in fact there are complicated traumas really throughout our society. I want us to be able to hold these kinds of multidimensional, multifocal thinking when we think about moral injury, because in fact, moral injury is very much the similar kind of issue. If we just look for acute, morally injurious, traumatic events, we'll find some, but we're also needing to find more of them if we're really going to do, I think, good, effective work. And to be able to recognize and really engage with these dimensions is a part of informing our work that way. When we think about trauma, again, going back to the sort of, are you all good on Monday or are you kind of all messed up on Wednesday? My experience is that traumatic stress is actually something that takes place much more on a continuum, right? It's much more of a spectrum that, there may be ways that we would characterize ourselves in the green, so to speak, in terms of, hey, all this kind of stuff is working for me. But it's not like we're either in the green or we're in the red, right? Many of us have days where we're in the yellow, right? Where we're irritable, where we didn't sleep so well, where, some of our normal behavior and normal functioning, normal coping strategies, aren't really kind of working as normally as they usually are, but that's more or less temporary and we kind of get back to what's normal for us. It doesn't mean that that's not traumatic stress, right? I want us to be able to think, again, more inclusively about these dynamics, because also in between the yellow and the red is something maybe a little orange, right? A little more severe, a little more long lasting, but also something that I think can be cared for well, if we're able to have some good support around that. And only in its most radical or severe form of suffering would we see something like PTSD or moral injury as such. And if we can think about this as a continuum, I think we will think differently about care. I think we'll think differently about response. Because in fact, while there are some days where we're all green and good, and there may also have been some experiences that really are that most severe form of suffering, there's also a lot that kind of happens in between the green and the red. So where does that come from, right? That stuff that we start seeing, where does it come from? Well, with a PTSD diagnosis, we're talking about fear as being the kind of central emotional experience. It is an overwhelming trauma that has to do with life threat, either to yourself or to somebody who's important to you. And you're fearful of that, right? Fear ends up being the kind of dominant, overwhelming emotional expression of that trauma. But there are other trauma stories, right, that aren't fear-based. Here's one that we have found out very clearly about in this last 20 years of war making, and that is fatigue. It is possible to be so exhausted, so worn out, what the military sometimes very gently calls wear and tear, okay? In a way to kind of try to normalize fatigue and exhaustion. What we're talking about here is traumatic levels of exhaustion, right? Not just I'm feeling a little tired today, but in fact that our inner energies are so depleted that we're not really able to just catch a nap and then get back to the work, but that in fact this is a longer lasting kind of trauma. And tired like that can bring to the surface those same post-traumatic symptoms that we were talking about earlier, right? So even without having a bad Tuesday, so to speak, some of those chronic and environmental dynamics can lead to a kind of tiredness that is in and of itself traumatic. I think we would also identify that there's traumatic loss, right? That we can experience grief and loss at a traumatic level, again, that would kind of overwhelm our normal functioning, our normal coping strategies and normal meaning making. And then thinking about moral distress. And here I use moral distress, again, thinking of that spectrum and that continuum, recognizing that moral injury is the most radical or severe form of moral distress. With moral distress and moral injuries, what we're seeing as the sort of central emotional expression would be moral emotions. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail in just a few moments. Like right now, for instance, if you're ready to move in that direction. So here are two moral emotions that we're probably well aware of: guilt and shame. I would differentiate these as guilt being, I did something that, or didn't do something that brought harm or crisis or tragedy to a situation, right? Shame, I think of as being different from guilt, whereas guilt is localized, so to speak, to a particular doing or not doing. Shame takes on a totalizing effect. So instead of I did something, it becomes I am something. Okay, can we see a little bit of a difference there? But what you're getting here with these moral emotions is a inward directed moral evaluation, okay, a moral judgment, right? It's about me. I did or didn't do something. Um, we also see some other kinds of moral emotions in moral injury. And sometimes those are outward evaluations, right? It's not about what I did or didn't do. It's about what you did or didn't do, right? And there might be disgust, there might be contempt. What you're seeing in both of these, whether inward or outward evaluations, might actually express as anger, right? It might express as rage. Again, rage at other or also self-directed kind of rage. Somewhere in between the inner and the outer, you might also see embarrassment and humiliation in that kind of morally injurious experience. And of course, there are some experiences where it's not just on me or on you, but in fact is some kind of complex mixture of the both. And if you're seeing, again, that in a spectrum, you might be getting some distress. If you see that even more significantly, you're seeing that as an injury. Now, one thing I want us to think about immediately when we see these moral emotions is recognizing that many, many times these moral emotions express themselves in life-limiting kinds of ways, whether that's self-harming behaviors, whether that's other harming kind of behaviors. But at their core, moral emotions, including these moral emotions, do not have uh, necessarily negative consequences. What they are at their core is actually an emotional expression that is trying to get our attention, and ultimately is about getting our attention about something that has happened that should not have happened, right? Within the sense of kind of moral rightness or moral covenant, but is also getting our attention so that something can be repaired, something can be reconciled, something can be restored. That's important for us to realize, because if we see these moral emotions in our own experience or in others' experience, and we think to ourselves, I have to alleviate the guilt. I have to alleviate the guilt so that the moral suffering is alleviated. We've actually sort of got it exactly upside down. What we really want to be doing is recognizing that these are natural expressions, and if we work with them in a constructively engaged way, we'll begin to map the dynamics of responsibility, right? Somebody doesn't feel guilt unless they feel responsible. And rather than trying to alleviate the responsibility, as is sometimes our impulse when we hear somebody share a story, we say, "Oh, Zachary, no, that wasn't on you. That wasn't your responsibility." It's a very natural response. And we're doing it out of an impulse of trying to alleviate the suffering. We think if we alleviate the responsibility, therefore we'll alleviate the guilt, therefore we'll alleviate the suffering. It's completely understandable that we would think of it that way. The problem is, what happens, again, quite unintentionally, is that we end up guilting guilt and shaming shame in those spaces, telling folks, don't feel what you're feeling, in other words. And in doing that, it's very easy for people to feel very sort of further isolated or alienated or mistrustful of that kind of response. If I'm telling you I feel responsible, believe me, right? If I'm telling you somebody else is responsible and I'm downright furious about it, believe me, right? Start from that place and begin to constructively work with that responsibility agency. That's our moral agency, right? That's where it is, right there. And I'll say to you quite flatly, I don't want to live in a world that is any more irresponsible than the one we currently live in. A number of our societal and global tragedies and crises have to do with the sort of wanton expression of irresponsibility. I want to try to thicken our sense of responsibility. So when I hear somebody saying, or when I hear in myself, there's responsibility here. I want us all to be able to engage with that in a way that recognizes and ultimately empowers that responsibility toward reparative action, right? And reparative practice. And we'll get to pick up on some of that next week. Just as we thought about traumatic stress on that continuum, we can also track moral distress and moral injury as such. There may be certain indicators of somebody's moral identity kind of being, again, good to go in the green as such. There also are certainly times in which any of us may feel that we're in the proverbial yellow here, right? Where we're having some confusion, our purpose, our meaning feels a little disoriented. We're asking some questions, but maybe it's temporary, right? Maybe we get a little bit of the response that we need and we're able to kind of get ourselves back in a good oriented place. Maybe it happens a little bit more severe. And so we're more in a kind of orange category, and we're dealing with some of this kind of stuff. Again, it's lingering, it stays with us. But that all that happens really, that there's a lot of moral distress that looks yellow or looks orange. Not all of it looks like it in the red, but certainly there is moral suffering like that. And what's here in the red speaks to moral injury, kind of moral distress, moral suffering in its most severe kind of state. So here's the kind of the last idea that I want to offer to us before we have an opportunity to dialogue a little bit. And that is, as I have worked with the moral injury material, I have wondered to myself, what is it that we mean when we say moral, right? If I had a broken arm and I came to you and I said, I have a broken arm, and you didn't know what an arm was, right? How would you be expected to know how to fix my injury, right? There's a sort of immediate question that comes to mind for me about this. And as I look through the literature, that's one of the places where there's not really good consensus about what we mean by moral. So often what happens is we sort of talk about it in a secondary kind of way, right? Well, this person is having confusion about this, or, they're not feeling good about that. So this is a moral injury. But I wanted to think about, what is the site of this trauma? What is the site of this injury? And can we come up with some common language that we can really identify? What is it that we're talking about being rattled, being shaken, and stressed out and breached in certain times? And so the language that I have been using for a number of years is, can we talk about moral identity as moral orienting systems? And this immediately takes us away from the idea that moral identity is static, right? That my moral identity is the same as your moral identity. No, moral identity is better understood as something that is carried in my body, right? Not just in my brain, but in my whole cognitive physiology as such, that we could track it with values, beliefs, and behaviors, right? So this isn't just my religious identity. It could include my religious identity, but that's not the full boundaries of it, right? Lots of us in an American context have picked up other beliefs and other values that we weren't taught by our religious community, but in fact, we picked up other places. And what are those behaviors, right? How do I act morally as being sort of within those behaviors? Well, where did these come from, right? Did I send away, use my Amazon gift card, to order this, and the next day my values and my beliefs and my behaviors came along? No. These are all connected in a web of meaningful relationships. These are meaningful beliefs and values and behaviors because they came into our lives through meaningful relationships. Be those our family of origin, be those mentors and teachers, be those religious leaders or other sort of figures that we saw as being kind of morally ideal. And we saw that and we said, that inspires me, right? That is meaningful to me. And I want to sort of take that on and have that be a part of my moral orienting system. And of course, a lot of this stuff we weren't even necessarily that conscious of, right? Do we think, for example, why is it that people keep buying tickets for a superhero movie that more or less has the same plot, movie after movie after movie after movie? Well, it turns out, at least my hypothesis that I'll raise to you, is that it turns out for many of us, the plot arc of a superhero movie is quite cathartic because it gives us a certain kind of narrative frame to think about exactly what we're talking about today, about moral suffering, right? So think about any of your favorite superhero movies. If you're like me, you like these movies, right? Something happens kind of early on that looks something like moral distress and moral suffering. A significant loss, a significant crisis kind of takes place. But what happens at the end, right? The superhero always defeats, the supervillain, right? There is that kind of redemptive suffering outcome, right? That kind of takes place in this kind of way. And this ends up being cathartic. Now, I have heard versions of redemptive suffering in my religious community. There are certainly resonances of redemptive suffering in most Christian traditions and other traditions. But I also realize I get that kind of moral narrative every time I buy my ticket for the superhero movie, and I hear that many times a year, whereas I only hear about redemptive suffering from my church pastor on Easter. Right, that's when when Christians tend to do a big thing about redemptive suffering. Right, so where we get this stuff can certainly be religious, both implicitly and explicitly, but it's also more than that. So I'm not going to use spiritual orienting systems or religious orienting systems, because in fact, we need to talk about moral values, beliefs, and behaviors in a more inclusive way than that. But I also want to recognize my moral orienting system isn't going to be your moral orienting system, because we are subjected to different meaningful relationships. And that's a wonderful thing, right? But how you were influenced, how you developed, how you were shaped is different, and is always going to be different from mine. Now, that's crucial in terms of thinking about providing care, because in fact, if I superimpose my expectations of moral orientation on you, that might be quite problematic. In other words, right? I might be thinking this is what moral is, and in fact, that may not be what moral is, just in a very fundamental way. So giving ourselves enough nuancing and complexity here to recognize some of these dynamics is really important. One more piece to say about moral orienting systems, and then we'll let it walk around a little bit. And that is to recognize that your moral orienting system functions in a particular way in a particular moral environment, or what I would say moral world. Okay, so it's not that you're a different person when you are taking a class at Syracuse than you were when you were wearing a uniform and serving your country. Um, but your moral orienting system functioned in some different ways for you, because in fact, the moral world of a classroom at Syracuse is fundamentally different. And we'll sort of delve into this in just a moment. But I want us to think about that, because it's not like we're different people, but it is like a moral orienting system that is able to kind of have some flexibility. It's able to be agile and adaptive in these spaces. So here's an example of this, right? So again, I promise this is the very last visualization of my very amateurish artwork that you'll have to deal with today. So here is the 18-year-old who is, enjoying a day after school, hanging out with his friends at the mall. His hair is all, kind of jacked up and whatnot. And he's there, and he's in the moral world of his school. He's in really what we would think of maybe as a very civilian context, right? He's going to school, he's going to the shopping mall, he's hanging with his friends, and his moral orienting system is more or less functional within that civilian context. But then he starts thinking to himself, as he sees the military recruiter at the other side of the shopping mall, what if I were to go be a part of this other moral world? Now, I will grant you, he's probably not thinking about these things, but we're sort of thinking with him, right? As he is making this journey, he's thinking, I would like to go be in the military. And so what happens is he gets a close shave on that jacked up hair, and he goes in and he's in the military. Now, what the military knows very well, and many of you have known firsthand, is that the military recognizes that it can't pick up the civilian 18-year-old from the shopping mall and drop them into a kinetic operational space and have that person be able to function and do their job. What they need is really some of the most intense and formational training that we have kind of evidenced anywhere in our society, and that is sometimes called basic training or boot camp. And what I want us to appreciate is that part of what is being shaped in boot camp and basic training is not just about how to fire a weapon, not just about how to wear the uniform, but in fact, it is about doing some re-engineering to one's moral orienting system. And that what's happening there is some of those important markers of your civilian moral orienting system are getting, at the very least, readjusted and reordered, if not really kind of significantly reshaped, right? We are not, for example, in frequent contact with our meaningful relationships in the civilian world when we're in that training environment. The meaningful relationships are that of our drill instructor. They're that of the folks that we're sharing the barracks with. That becomes the kind of meaningful social relational world that we're about. And as such, we are also beginning to learn some new behaviors, learn some new beliefs, and learn some new values. Some pretty significant stuff is happening to our moral orienting system, were we to use that. And it's not just for no reason at all. It's so that we can function and survive. We can have the moral orienting system that we need within a military moral world. All right. I know I'm moving through some pretty conceptual stuff quickly, so hopefully you're hanging in here with me. The question comes up for me: what does it mean to come home? Right? If this has happened for me, right? If I have lived and survived in this military moral world, what does it mean to come home? And one of the sort of immediate challenges is that American society seems to suggest to our homecoming veterans that really all they need to do is find a time machine and go back in time to their civilian moral orienting system that they once had as an 18-year-old, kid. And you were more or less a functional civilian, again, more or less for some of us, and you just need to re-become that person and kind of get on with your life. Well, for those of us who can't secure a time machine, this becomes a particular kind of challenge, right? What does it mean to re-enter into a civilian world that in some ways is familiar and yet in some ways now seems very unfamiliar? And if we understand those changes that have taken place within our moral orienting system, I think we can begin to see how in fact that could be quite distressing in and of itself to be making that transition, because of course what's missing here in large part is a re-entry program commiserate with basic training or boot camp, right? We don't have that intensity. We don't have the sort of obligatory nature of that, right? Some of us have participated in retreats and workshops and other kinds of functions that have helped to try with that kind of homecoming journey as such, but not everybody's doing that. So it's something that I have to choose for myself. I have to self-select into. And in doing that, of course, there are many people who never self-identify, who never show up and sign up for that kind of material because it's not obligatory, right? So from a Department of Defense perspective, we're not doing this in a programmatic kind of way. Instead, what we're doing in a programmatic way are largely some PowerPoint presentations and a ticket home and thank you for your service. And that, when you contrast it with the intensity of formation and reformation that takes place in basic training or boot camp, you can see what a deficit we're immediately creating for our folks to come home. And then of course, what happens is we say to people, this is a mental health issue, right? We're saying, if you're having a hard time acclimating, there must be something wrong with you. And in pathologizing that, we are doing what? We are further isolating and alienating folks who may in fact feel like, yeah, I'm suffering with some stuff, but I don't want to be looked at like that. I don't want to be seen as a head case. I'm dealing with some stuff, but you're going to have to leave me be so that I can deal with that stuff. Just one thing I'll leave us with before we open it up to conversation, and I relieve you from my very amateurish illustrations, was an experience that I had on an ongoing basis when I was working as a chaplain resident at the Atlanta VA. And I was working with a number of outpatient groups, predominantly Vietnam veterans, so of that certain kind of age strata. And about half of our group had been dealing with PTSD symptoms for a long time. And and maybe were beginning to get some VA response to that, or maybe they'd been within the VA system for quite a while. We also had a pretty large minority of folks for whom their PTSD symptoms had shown up relatively recently. And what I noticed in common for so many of them is that the PTSD symptoms, the trauma symptoms, had shown up in the near aftermath of them retiring from their job. I thought, boy, that's a really weird pattern. Like, what's going on there? Why did they seemingly do okay without this kind of traumatic suffering for decades in some cases? And then I started asking them about their work. And they would say, sometimes with a lot of pride, I was the best employee. I was the first to show up. I was the last to leave. I poured myself into that job. And what I came to realize is we, and me in particular, had thought to ourselves, as well as they had thought to themselves, I must be doing okay. Because workaholism within an American context is a socially appropriate coping strategy. But when that coping strategy wasn't available anymore, here came the traumatic symptoms to the surface. And it was then at which they realized, I never actually came home. I just took all of this and poured it into a job. Just like some of my folks had been pouring it into a 12-pack every night in the garage. There wasn't anything structurally different about the 12-pack in the garage or the working 80 hours a week. It was just that from a societal perspective, we had seen workaholism as being flourishing, right? As being successful, that your reentry was good and this vet's reentry over here was bad because you have a drinking problem. And really, both of these folks were trying to find available coping strategies to deal with the fact that reentry was never supported adequately in terms of really being able to reorient and reintegrate in meaningful ways in that homecoming. So I'll pause there with these comments, recognizing that I'll have an opportunity to share a little bit more with you now in question and answer. And also please come back next week and let's continue to kind of build on some of the foundations that we've talked about here.
Thank you so much, Zachary. And I want to say that we're opening it up now in the chat for people to ask questions. So please put your questions into the chat. We have two moderators, Jen Jeffrey and Jen Reddy, who will be bringing your questions forward. If you have more of a comment to make as opposed to a question, feel free to offer that in the chat. But we're hoping that we can have some conversation. And also, as Dr. Moon mentioned, he will be back next Friday at noon to lead another webinar. And Zach, do you want to say something before we go into the comment part about what you'll be doing next time so people have a sense of the continuity?
Sure. So how we designed these two lectures kind of in relationship was to think about how can we build a foundation of kind of understanding about moral injury so that next week we can return to this and think about what some of those reparative practices and processes are really all about. So if you're having questions about, okay, Dr. Moon, so what am I supposed to do with this? The answer to that is come back next week and let's talk about it. But realizing that if we start by talking about, what recovery looks like, and we haven't actually talked about what's happening there in terms of the human experience of moral distress and moral injury, it's sort of like the bottom is lifted out essentially. So we need to kind of do both of these things together.
Thank you. And I'm going to turn it over to the moderators, and looks like we have some comments and questions lighting up the chat.
So one person asked if they could have a copy of the PDFs, and they like your illustrations.
So that's morally questionable at best if you like those illustrations. I have some questions. But yes, I'm more than happy to share this material.
And somebody said it was a wonderful presentation. Both of us are here who lead moral injury treatment in the Syracuse VA. We love your framework. It really resonates with what we see in the veterans we serve.
Yeah, thank you for that. Again, I had a chance to really cut my teeth in the VA hospital system, and I continue to work with a number of clinical colleagues there. I hope my comments didn't come off as negative to the work that's happening within that clinical and medical space. But one of the things that I would really want to say to those of us now working outside of a healthcare context, in community context, in higher ed context, perhaps in leadership of religious congregations, is to say, we all need to be involved in this too. Okay, we've got great folks working within the VA healthcare context. They're doing as much as they can do. We need to not expect that all of the moral injury stuff can really be worked out in a healthcare context. Expecting that is unreasonable, and it actually sort of sets us up for failure. There is some pretty unique stuff that needs to happen in an educational space. There's some unique stuff that can happen really well in the space of a religious tradition. There's some really important stuff that can happen in writing workshops and yoga retreats. And now I'm going to get ahead of myself talking about the stuff that we'll pick up next week. But I really just want to make sure that you all hear me in terms of saying the VA has been doing this work tirelessly. And one of the failures, I think, on a societal level is that there's been a lot of outsiders who have said, oh, well, look at what the VA isn't doing, without recognizing that there are some real limits and constraints to what the VA can accomplish. And it's unfair to them. And it's really a complete miscalculation on our part to sort of expect that this can sort of fully be addressed within a healthcare context. We really all need to be involved in that.
So we got an email question from Joshua Peterson. He said, you mentioned that moral injury model has been used most frequently in the military context, but suggests that it has been valuable applicability outside it. To you, what are some other areas where the vocabulary of moral injury might be most helpful?
Thanks. That's exactly the right question, and a question I would love to be able to spend the rest of the day unpacking with you. It's a crucially important question because, again, so much of the literature has really been focused on the military context, and that is deserving. However, for anyone who's been paying attention to the headlines, even in this last week, you may know I'm located in the city of Chicago. This week, a police officer shot a 13-year-old child who was unarmed and who had his arms raised. This is something that's happening frequently in our society. It is a natural response that we would feel moral outrage about what is happening in terms of these policing situations in our society. It, in fact, is something that compels some people to activism. It is also something that sometimes can become quite debilitating for ourselves and for people in our community, again, in very natural kinds of reasons. And part of the reason it is that our sense of rightness, right, our sense that our universe has some kind of moral goodness to it, is betrayed when people with state-supported, taxpayer-supported authority, in fact, step beyond the appropriate limitations of their power in the taking of a vulnerable life in the way that this happens. So if there is moral distress that you feel when you read some of those headlines, I would just say that's an absolutely natural thing. And I know many wonderful Chicago police officers who also feel moral distress and deep anguish when these sorts of situations happen within the police department, because in fact they realize where they are situated in this community context as such. A few others in terms of context, and again, we could spend a lot of time with this. I've had enough conversations with people who work within the healthcare system, a healthcare system that is often outside of the VA, dominated by private insurance and the whole industrial complex that's built up in our society around healthcare, as setting us up for certain kinds of moral distress, right? When a medical professional can't do the fullness of their job because the insurance doesn't sign off on it, that is a morally injurious situation. Here's one, well, I'll give you two more to think about. One more, what is happening with public school education is a laboratory for moral distress, particularly for public school teachers who, as I think we are all aware, are almost always underpaid, with the sort of sense of you so love your job that you will do this very, very hard job for no pay. That appears to be the sort of hypothesis involved there. When actually what brings people to that is more than love. It's actually a sense of moral responsibility, right? To give something back, right? To help a future generation to be well educated. And then increasingly, we are in not only an underfunded school system, but in a school system that is myopically focused on testing as being an assessment tool for learning. Most public school, well, all the public school teachers that I've ever talked to has said at best, that's very problematic, if not just being an utter fallacy. So having public school teachers work in an educational environment that is oriented around something that structurally is limited at best, if not completely problematic in totality, is in and of itself a morally distressing situation. So here's the issue that we should take up when we think about these other contexts. What is the code language that is currently masking our understanding of this as moral distress or not being moral distress? And the most common verbiage that's used, and again, you can immediately start running through some professional contexts where you've heard this language, is the B word, burnout, right? We talk about burnout all the time with public school teachers. We talk about burnout all the time with religious leaders, right? Oh boy, you know, they're not taking care of themselves. Burnout is almost always code language for moral distress, if not moral injury. And if we just did an inventory of how many professions are talking about high rates of burnout, healthcare is certainly included in that as well, we would begin to realize what's burning people out is moral distress, again, in a chronic and environmental kind of way. If we only have eyes to see the acute event, we're going to miss a lot of what's happening in terms of moral distress and moral injury in our society, because in fact, we're going to come up with other words for it, right? We're going to call it burnout instead of calling it what it actually is. So again, part of this is the importance of concept and language, how that frames our understanding of what this is. It's important to me that we don't stop talking about moral injury, because moral injury in its most severe form of moral suffering is deserving of our attention. It's important to me that we don't stop talking about the military context, because we have only really begun to scratch the surface on what's happening in that situation. But it is also important to me that we talk about moral distress in a continuum, that we start decoding burnout and really start talking about what burnout actually is, and that we also talk about other contexts where these dynamics are taking place. So we need to increase the visibility and engagement with this, not say, well, we talked about the military for a while, we don't need to talk about that anymore. No, we need to keep talking about that, but we also need to really expand our thinking and our engagement.
So another question.
Oops, sorry, have we brought Adam Pritchard's question forward yet?
Not yet. You can, if you want to, you can.
Do you have thoughts on how the just world fallacy, belief that good and evil eventually get what they deserve, impacts the difficulty of transitions between moral orienting systems?
Yeah, that's exactly aligned with some of what I was suggesting in terms of thinking about redemptive suffering. And again, what we get from the superhero movies and what many of us have kind of carried with us, either from religious sources or secular sources, is the idea really that I am the hero of my own story, right? We might not feel particularly heroic, but I am the protagonist. Okay. I am the author of this story. I am the one. And in as much as I am the center of that universe, you know, there are folks who are helping me to be my best self. And there are folks who I may then sort of come to see as being antagonists, right, in this story, right? Folks who are creating certain kinds of issues. Now, I'm not the writing specialist, so I'm going to leave that to Dr. Schell to more sort of fully develop these points. But in as much as that is a very socialized and then saturated kind of way in which we sort of think about ourselves in an American context that so persistently prioritizes the individual protagonist, right? It's hard for us, for example, when there's a global pandemic, to think to ourselves, well, I'm so used to being the individual protagonist of my story. How do I feel about the pandemic? it was a real public crisis to try to get a bunch of individual thinking folks to think in a way that actually serves public health, right? We can't think about public health. We can't address public health if all of us are thinking I'm the protagonist of my own story. We have to start thinking about a collectivization of our belonging and of our togetherness, right? That wearing a mask, for example, is not just about whether or not I personally like to wear masks, whether it fits into my fashion sense or not, but rather my wearing of a mask has to do with a sense of collective responsibility to a greater, more collective and communal good, right? These dynamics show up in so many different places. And if we're oriented, right, as many of us are, to thinking I'm the protagonist of my story, I'm dealing with some mess right now, right? But I know this is only the first 30 minutes of the movie. So there must be a whole bunch more of the movie where I just start getting to just totally get down and kick butt on all of the evil, right? All of the bad guys, right? They're going to get it. They're going to get it. They're going to get it. And it's going to be so cathartic and it's going to be so good at the end. And unfortunately, there is so much human suffering that doesn't resemble that at all. And so it becomes a challenge for us personally. I think it becomes a challenge for us when we're responding to people who are suffering, right? To try to encourage in a way of sort of saying things like, God doesn't give you more than you can handle, right? Which totally feeds into that cinematic narrative about saying, well, of course you've been knocked down, but that's just the bad guy. The bad guy's going to get it because God is the director of this movie and God wants the movie to turn out this way. And that can be so, again, largely unintentionally, that can be such a cruel leveling to have that kind of encouragement, which again perpetuates and extends this kind of idea of, if my suffering is not redemptive, what is it? Doesn't this then confirm, and this is the problem, if we only have heroes and we only have villains, if I come up short being a hero, what am I? The only part left for me in the movie is to be a villain. And that's excruciating, right? It's excruciating to fall from hero to villain in the blink of an eye. We have to be able, and again, I'm going to leave this to Dr. Shell to be able to do this well. We have to be ready to engage with narratives that have characters who aren't just either a hero or a villain, right? We need narrative frameworks. We need cultural consciousness that understands goodness in other ways, expressions and actions and journeys that are not just the hero's journey, right? They have to be more than that. We need more cultural consciousness. We need more narrative frames that are able to hold more of that.
Thank you. I think we're going to bring some more questions forward, but I would love to talk maybe at the next webinar about complex narrative frames. And
Okay.
because one of the contexts I'm coming from is the veterans writing group that
Yes.
we've had for 11 years. And there's some veterans from the writing group here in the session today, but
Yep.
how to tell your story.
Yes.
And what are the complex frameworks for understanding the ambiguities and the moral
Yes.
questions and also the failings of self and the systems,
Yes.
which is coming out in some of the questions too. I'll turn it back to both Jens if they want to bring forward questions. Thank you.
Do you want, how about Garrett Botha has asked twice now, will you talk more on the difficulties inherent in dualism with regard to moral injury? I love these philosophical questions.
Yeah, no, this is philosophical, right? So again, part of that dualism shows up in terms of the good versus evil kind of narrative framework that we were just unpacking a little bit here. And that again, from many cultural sources, religious and otherwise, there have been particular and I'll use theological, although I would also claim that the superhero movie has a certain kind of theological premise to it as well. So that these theological frameworks and these narrative frameworks as such seem to suggest certain things to us. And one of the ones that's very heavy in an American context, whether it's Christianized or not, has to do with sin. And sin, 9 times out of 10, really more like 99 times out of 100, is traditionalized and narrated as an individual issue, right? This is something that just needs individual confession, needs individual reparation as such. Only in some traditions and some narrative frames do you have expression of sin that takes on communal, societal, and collective, really systemic kind of dimensions to it, right? This is why, again, depending on how well read you are in theology, why liberation theology, Black theology, womanist theologies are so necessary in our corrective, kind of corrective measures to our theological consciousness. These are expressions largely Christian that have begun to really unpack and deconstruct the kind of thinking that goes into, again, this kind of over-privileging of sin as an individual kind of experience. Because, of course, then what it sets up is, well, it's just me all by myself. So much of what moral injury really, I think, brings up to us necessarily are those moral emotions, the pro-social function of those moral emotions, that even this guilt and the shame that really makes me want to hide, right? I think I messed up. I think I'm messed up. Seemingly, it's entirely counterintuitive that I would want to go out and talk to anybody about that, right? I totally appreciate that it's counterintuitive, and yet that moral emotion is asking for that. That's what remedy really looks like. That's what recovery really looks like, is if I were to allow that energy to actually take me into a place where I'm beginning to get that kind of pro-social, relational kind of support. And again, that's a different idea of sin, right? Sin is also one of those things that, again, as it's individualized, can become very isolating as such, and really alienate folks from the fold. If we were able to sort of realize, wait, when we mess up, it's not about exile. That's not the only mathematics here, in other words. There's also something that is about reclamation, and it is ultimately about reparation. And again, we'll do a more concrete treatment of that next week. But these questions are taking us in that direction, which is just right.
So we've got a couple other questions, and Garrett asked another one that, and I don't want to give too much preference here, but he was wondering if you could connect it to the hero's journey in Joseph Campbell.
Yeah, we don't really have time to do an adequate treatment of that, because Campbell's work, again, is so, and again, most of us know Joseph Campbell's work not from Joseph Campbell. We know it from Star Wars. So this is why it's important for us to really, for those of you who don't know, Star Wars is really just a complete ripoff on Campbell's work, and not in a unnamed kind of way, but in a explicitly named kind of way. So I didn't mean to be flippant to use kind of media examples or popular examples like cinema. That is where we often get these narrative frameworks. And again, not just once, but in perpetuity, in a kind of way that it really does kind of develop our sense. If the premise is I'm the protagonist of my story, right? I'm the hero, and I go to see the hero movie, right? Again, I come to sort of live through this journey vicariously, and ultimately experience this kind of vicarious catharsis with the hero, who then stands over the vanquished body of the villain. And I think there are many of us who realize that evil doesn't work like that sin doesn't work like that moral injury even doesn't work like that. And we still, I still love going to see the movie, because that's still in me, right? That's still in my imagination and consciousness. And damn it, I wish it worked like that, right? I wish at the end of, that 2 hours, everything got, cleaned up, and it all got sort of finished off in this redemptive kind of way. So whether we're conscious of it or not, there is a kind of catharsis seeking that I think we do when we participate in those kinds of ways. But we'll leave Joseph Campbell alone for today, only in which to say that his work is actually even more saturated in cultural consciousness than I think we even realize.
So another one, and I know that you did briefly touch on this at the very beginning, but perhaps you could go a little more into depth. There have been a couple of questions on, again, clarifications of the differences between PTSD and moral injury. And specifically one, that's asking the difference between moral injury and cumulative trauma resulting in PTSD.
Okay. So those are actually kind of two different pieces. So let me pick up the cumulative trauma. One of the ways that when I offered the multifocal lens, thinking about the different dimensions of trauma, that's where I really want us to be able to have a constructive treatment of something that looks maybe what we would call cumulative trauma, which is what I would call it in terms of thinking about where is it coming from or how is it impacting, is to look at those chronic, environmental, and in some cases transgenerational trauma, right? Can we read, for example, a text like post-traumatic slave syndrome, for those of you who know that title, right? What DeGruy is doing there in that text is largely unpacking transgenerational trauma, right? To say African-American folks today are dealing with things that have happened throughout generations of racialized violence and chattel slavery that if we were only to look at acute events, right, would we say to that African-American person, well, you weren't in slavery, well, you don't know about Jim Crow, well, you weren't pulled over, right? Even if there is an African-American person who hasn't been subjected to some kind of racialized violence in a microaggressive way, right? Even if we imagine that person would still be carrying with them transgenerational trauma from these generations that have come before. When we talk about things like racial justice or racial equity, when we have conversations like, what does reparations look like for American slavery? Without a transgenerational epigenetics informed perspective on this, I don't think we have a very strong rationale, right? I think there are naysayers who can immediately say, well, you yourself, all individually, you've had a hard time, but it's not deserving of, or it's not related to. When in fact we have to just say resolutely, it is absolutely related in significant and formative kinds of ways. So I think that's necessary when we think about cumulative is, again, how do we language that and how do we include it in our terms of our thinking about trauma? One of the reasons why I differentiate fear from grief, from fatigue, and from moral distress or moral anguish is that I want us to recognize, both for ourselves in our own experience and for those that we're working with, many traumatic experiences are not one or the other, right? That many of them have a way of including more than one, if not all of those simultaneously. And I'll give a personal example just to illustrate this a little bit. I was in a car accident when I was 20 years old and injured in this car accident. This was a single car accident. And I was in this vehicle with my father. He was sitting in the passenger seat. And he and I, as we often do, had gotten into a very impassioned conversation on a long road trip. We were driving on a very narrow road that had no shoulder. The vehicle essentially slipped off of the road and was about to go barreling off of the road. And in overcorrecting my steering, I flipped the car into 2 full barrel rolls. The car itself was completely demolished, and both my father and I sustained injuries. Now, that could just look to us like an acute trauma that was fear-based, right? The imminent potential of loss of life, both for self and important others, right? So all by itself, that could look like a PTSD diagnosis, again, according to the diagnostic manual. However, as I processed that situation, what I actually felt more, I didn't feel scared about the I almost died part. I felt scared about the moral responsibility that I was behind the wheel and that my father was injured. So PTSD doesn't necessarily give us enough to be able, again, think about the multifocal lens and to think about the kind of multiple sources of trauma. We need to include this stuff in our engagement with trauma so that we can actually see the complexity that's present there, right? So while that car accident could look like acute, fear-based post-traumatic stress disorder, it also had significant moral dimensions, right? It was also completely natural for me to think about what would it have been like if my father had died? Right? So there's grief and there's loss that's also very thick in that traumatic experience. And both raises questions of responsibility and raises dimensions of anticipatory grief. Again, both in the immediate aftermath and in the long going. So those are dimensions that I want to raise up to us to, again, think about what trauma looks like at the surface, right? In terms of those behaviors and those symptoms, right? In a clinical way of thinking about it. Um, we don't always know the trauma story until we're in a situation to write about it, maybe in the writing workshop, or to have a trustworthy conversation and share some of that story. The extent that we are in a position to be on the receiving or receptive end to some of that story, we can begin to really appreciate the complexity of that. I want us as a broader society to be better equipped to hear the fullness of traumatic suffering and not just sort of say, how do we alleviate the symptoms as quickly as possible? That's a wonderful thing. It's not everything. And we need to be able, I think, ultimately to be more capable of hearing the deep stories. And here's where this takes us to, particularly around the elements of moral distress and moral injury. In all of those contexts that I named earlier, there is collective attention that must be paid to how our nation makes war, how our nation does healthcare, how our nation does public education, how our nation does policing. If we continue to treat this as an individual problem, the collective attention never gets paid, right? Because it's the problem that Zachary has, that Zachary needs to go to the VA and get some help for, or the problem that Zachary's back out in the garage every night with a 12-pack, what a sorry bastard he is with his drinking problem. At the point of which our broader society becomes more capable of really hearing the moral dimensions of this trauma, we will be called more readily into collective response, into collective action. And that is the necessary sort of tipping point from my perspective, and what you all are a part of, right? The work that each and every one of you are involved in small and big ways is contributing to bringing us closer to a tipping point where we would have some long overdue and necessary conversations about military service, about public education, about healthcare, and the like.
So I'm looking at the time. I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll be thanking Dr. Moon for his remarks. And we have such a rich chat going here that we will be saving it and trying to respond to you if we don't get to what you asked. But do the moderators have one more question to bring forward?
There was one comment by Victor, he's talking about Jonathan Shay's work and talking about the focus on the betrayal by the leaders and not the pain or blame sins of its victims. And I think you just kind of touched on that, where we have to have this understanding to go forward. But do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I think Shay's contributions have been really significant and important, I think, in, again, raising attention and awareness around moral injury. And again, is the sort of conceptual framework that I would emphasize somewhat differently than Shay's would be, if we start by really tracking these moral emotions, right? It's possible that what Shay is talking about in terms of betrayal by those in positions of authority, right? That's that outward evaluation of a moral wrongdoing, right? It's an evaluation of that then gives rise to anger, to contempt, to disgust, right? So that what Shay is referring to there would certainly be appropriate within the framework that I offered. But I also want us to be able to see some of those other dynamics that are in play, because in fact, there are many moral injuries where I might have an evaluation of somebody else's doing and not doing. I also may carry some of that toward myself. I might direct some of that toward myself. And I think we ultimately, again, need to have an idea here that allows more than one thing to be possible at one time. So I would just encourage us to continue to develop our thinking in that way.
All right. Well, thank you so much. It's 1:20 and we've kept you a little bit over time, Dr. Moon, and we just want to thank you. And we want to thank all the attendees. Many of you stayed after and asked questions, made really interesting comments, also shared stories. So thank you for that. We will harvest this chat and work with it to try to respond to you if we didn't get to what you asked or what you wanted to talk about. And also, I just would ask that everyone come back if possible next week at noon to have part 2 where Dr. Moon will be getting more into some of the collective response issues that he was hinting at today, and that I think a lot of us are going to want to hear about. And it looks like in this audience, there's a lot of expertise. Many of you are running moral injury project initiatives. You're practitioners of various sorts, your veterans, your family members, or scholars. So please come back and let's continue this conversation. So without further ado, I just want to thank Dr. Moon. If you have the ability to like clap wherever you are, clap, and we'll kind of hear the collective reverberation in the universe. I want to thank our moderators. I want to thank Hendricks Chapel, and we will see you next week. And Dr. Moon, we just can't wait to hear part 2, because I think we're going to get into what is our responsibility and what do we need to do to address all of these issues. And I love how you connected it to policing, to racial justice, to domestic violence, so many of the issues that we're all thinking about on a daily basis in connection with military service and war making. So thank you so much.
And we will have the recording available on the website. So
That's right. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. I'm saving the chat, and we will see you next week. And thank you again, Dr. Moon. Wonderful job.